Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look, of course, at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Crerar, and the political editor of the Daily Mail, Jason Groves, with us from now until just before midnight and in Manchester. Welcome to both of you. So, to the front pages, let's start with the Metro. It leads on the cancellation of the northern leg of HS2, proclaiming it Manc robbery. The Guardian splashes with the same story, focusing on West Midlands Mayor Andy Street's disdain at the news. The FT also leading on protests against Rishi Sunak axing the line. The Eye suggests a Tory rebellion could be on the cards. While The Sun leads on Strictly Come Dancing head judge Shirley Ballas, saying death threats from trolls have left her scared to leave her home. So let's talk to our guests. Plenty more papers still to come. Jason and Pippa, welcome to both of you. So perhaps not surprising, HS2 leading the papers, the awkwardness of the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Jason, when are we going to hear this definitively? Is it going to be in Rishi Sunak's speech on Wednesday?
Well, everyone's very tight-lipped here, but I think it is, Anna. I think you're right. And I think that's the reason that they felt unable to say too much about this announcement. When we had a sort of similar leak about the net zero announcement a couple of weeks back, they brought forward the announcement. It was out the next day. They got on the front foot. This time, I think they feel constrained. I think the Prime Minister wants to make this announcement. He wants to make it in his own terms. He wants to make the case that there's a better way to spend this money and there's a better way for the North. And he doesn't want to do that in a sort of short TV clip. He wants to do it as part of his speech. And so you're left in this terrible position where every time a minister pops up, they're asked, are you going to do HS2? And they say, well, no decisions are made. I think the decision is made. And it's rather overshadowing the conference here. It's all very unfortunate for them.
Yes, the Daily Telegraph says that they understand the PM is to make the announcement tomorrow, which is obviously Wednesday for them, as part of his keynote speech at the Conservative Party conference. He will tell delegates in Manchester, the city most adversely affected, that the savings will free up more than £10 billion that can be spent on an east-west high-speed link called Northern Powerhouse Rail, as well as improvements to major roads and fresh cash for bus routes and pothole repairs. £10 billion, Pippa, it sounds a lot, but in the great scheme of HS2 and what has already been spent and what it promised to deliver and will now not, it doesn't seem so much.
No, and, you know, I mean, there may have been a £100 billion bill for HS2 overall, but as you say, just a fraction of that is being proposed to be spent on these other projects. And I think it's not just about the money that's being spent on them, it's about how realistic it is to announce projects, more regional projects, whether it's the east to west rail or more focused locally, now with any expectation of them being built anytime soon. And I think one of the political problems for Sunak and the government on this is that this is a project which was first proposed more than a decade ago. And you know, over the years, it's been increasingly under question. But we're finally in a position where it looks like the government's going to scrap that northern leg of it. And are people going to believe, people up here in Manchester, are they going to believe the government when they turn around and say, OK, we're not going to do this north-south project, but we are going to do this east-west one? You might need to wait a few years for it. And unfortunately, as we know, we've discussed many times, there is a sort of a flagging of growing scepticism in politicians and politics more generally across the board. And so having that once again, you know, people feeling that they've been made promises which are not being delivered on is going to be really difficult for them, particularly because, for right or wrong, this is a project which became a symbol of the flagship project, of infrastructure project, of levelling up. And that obviously was one of the reasons why Boris Johnson managed to win such a big victory at the last election. It doesn't look like that Rishi Sunak is going to be able to use that as a sort of, you know, a positive reason for voting the Conservatives this time round.
Yes, and they were championing the Towns Fund today, wasn't they, as a sort of, you know, diversion, I suppose, from this sort of levelling up agenda set by HS2. But plenty of reaction. The Metro, Jason, it's Manc robbery. This is the mayor there, Andy Burnham's fury. But also the West Midlands mayor, Andy Street, as well. I mean, what sort of reaction have you noticed on the conference floor?
Well, not so much on the conference floor, but Andy Street is as angry as I've seen him, and he is the most senior elected Conservative outside Westminster. You know, he runs this He's got the sort of flagship West Midlands mayoralty, and he has got steam coming out of his ears about this. We have not heard the last from him. I think so far the reaction has been a little bit muted. We haven't heard too much from the kind of Northern Research Group. But to be honest, you've heard it all in the last few days. You've seen Boris Johnson coming out saying if this goes ahead, it'll be a betrayal of not just the North, but also of the kind of levelling up agenda, which, let's not forget, was a central factor in the 2019 election win. So I think you'll hear more and more from that. And Rishi Sunak is really going to have his work cut out on Wednesday to convince people, as he believes, that this is genuinely the right decision, that this money will be better spent and that the North will end up with better transport links more quickly if they ditch the HS2 project, which, let's not forget, has had all sorts of problems, and invest it in particular, I think, a new line going across the country from Liverpool to Hull.
Well, the Eye talks about a Tory rebellion, quoting the Tory Mayor of West Midlands, Andy Street, "I won't let HS2 go without a fight," while the former Home Secretary Priti Patel warned of drastic moves will lead to serious questions for the Prime Minister. They also mention all those other Prime Ministers, Tory ones, of course, that have lined up: Boris Johnson, Theresa May and David Cameron, plus Gordon Brown for Labour. Don't mention Liz Truss. Now, she was on parade, one might say, today. Pippa, quick word on her. Maybe we'll come to her a bit later on. But there seemed to be a sort of a second agenda, didn't there, today at the Tory party conference? A second vision for the future, almost like they're already fighting over the rump of the Conservative Party, having already lost the election and having given up on the fight. What did you make of Liz Truss there today?
If you're Prime Minister a year out or 9 months out from a general election, you want your Tory MPs to be united. You want them to be doing what they're told, singing from the same hymn sheet. What you don't want them to be doing is to divide into factions, each calling for different things. Now, what Liz Truss is doing, and she's not alone in this, she's got a lot of support among the Tory backbenchers, is calling for tax cuts. Explicitly, she's talking about corporation tax, but tax cuts more generally. Now, this is, of course, something which goes to the heart of the row going on with the Conservative Party at the moment, with Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt saying, look, we've got this 5-point plan, we need to bring inflation down first. That's the thing which is really taking money out of people's pockets. And the indications that that's going to start to happen later next year. But they need to free up, they're going to have free up money to be able to fund those tax cuts if they are going to be able to deliver them. So we've seen, not just with HS2, but there's been a series of projects which have been under discussion in recent weeks. We had the triple lock. We talked about there's stuff in Hunt's speech about benefits potentially being cut. The NHS is also an area that could be looked at. Productivity in the public sector. They're desperately looking around for funds in order to be able to produce that rabbit out the hat at the general election. I'm getting off Liz Truss, but Liz Truss was there basically giving the Tory grassroots, the membership, of course, who've elected her and not Rishi Sunak, exactly what they wanted to hear. And that will have been a distraction for Sunak when he's trying to sort of, present his vision at this conference. But also, it's politically damaging for him because there's nothing that Labour and the opposition want to do more than to remind everyone what happened at this conference last year, which was completely chaotic and led to really very damaging time, not just for the Conservative Party, but for the country.
Yes, and her, her sort of rose-glowed, goggles, whatever it is she's wearing, Jason, talks about growth and make Britain grow again and all of that, forgetting that we're really in debt post-COVID and that actually to borrow money now costs the government a fortune. And do the Conservative Party really want 500,000 new homes in their green and present constituencies? I don't know how much of it was a sort of a reality check for some Conservatives, but she drew a crowd and she drew queues to get in, didn't she?
She drew a huge crowd. She was more popular this year than she was last year when she was Prime Minister. And it is incredible when you think back. This was only a year ago that she was giving her big conference speech. And actually, the big conference speech that she gave was not that different to the speech that she gave today. The themes are very much the same. We've got to go for growth. We've got to cut taxes. We've got to get all this red tape out the way and build, build, build. It's almost as if the events of last September and October hadn't happened as far as Liz Truss is concerned. The argument's the same and the messenger is the same. And as Pippa says, I think that last point is the most important. I think in large part, Rishi Sunak will view this as a sideshow. He was cracking jokes about her last week. I think he largely sees her as an irrelevance. I don't think the Tory revolt will be that big, but it's a reminder to the public that Liz Truss was a leader a year ago. They want to cast it off as a bad dream that the country had, almost like it never happened. Labour want to keep reminding us, and we'll hear more of that next week, I think, that Liz Truss, in their view, put people's mortgages up, and they're still up because of her. And here she is, back on the front pages, back at the Conservative Party conference, singing the same old tune.
Yes, well, let's talk about another former leader now, shall we? This time in the States, Donald Trump, front page of the Financial Times, sat in another court, Pippa.
Yes, well, I mean, I've lost track now of how many times he's appeared in court, how many different issues he's being hauled over the coals for, legal issues. He was in the court of Manhattan today, at the start of a civil fraud trial against him, and his oldest sons and the Trump Organisation are all in the dock. It's been brought by the State Attorney General, Letitia James. Obviously, as you would expect, Donald Trump has attempted to discredit her and the process before he even reached court, suggesting that it was an absolute scam and that the state of his finances was phenomenal. I mean, that's sort of a words he uses. He's always used during his presidency, and he suggests that this is a continuation of the single greatest witch hunt of all time. The bottom line is with Trump is that there are all these various cases that he's facing, but what it only seems to do is increase his popularity with his base, because he manages to convince them that this is the establishment out to get him and that it isn't actually about whether he's done anything illegal. So it will secure his position with the Republican base, which obviously will make it much more likely that he ends up as their candidate, taking on probably Joe Biden at the next presidential election. We thought we'd left all of this behind us 3 or 4 years ago. Well, it doesn't look like we have.
Yeah. Well, Liz Truss probably wants to come back too, doesn't she? So we'll talk about that a bit later on. In the meantime, let's go to the Metro. Doctors' strike, a risk to patients. I guess people know that. We're at 1 million procedures cancelled, appointments cancelled, Jason. Any discussion of that in the conference today? Anybody getting to the table to sort this out?
Well, there will be some discussion, I think, more tomorrow. I think Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, has got his big speech tomorrow. And I think the strike is going to be hard to miss at conference. I think we're going to have a demonstration by doctors outside. And, yeah, I mean, in some senses, it's another day, another strike. There is growing anger within, and concern, I'd say, within government about the scale of the strike, the fact you've got the doctors and consultants out again together. The fact that you're back on sort of Christmas Day services, when even some services which people might consider to be critical care, such as chemotherapy, are not being delivered. And I think they're looking inside government for what they can do. They feel like the BMA isn't serious about settling the strike. The BMA, of course, denies that, and they don't really know what to do, and they're sort of casting around for new ways to approach this. There's some talk about going to ACAS. But the two sides are so far apart, it's really quite hard to see how even the Great Conciliation Service is going to bring them together. It does feel like we're in for, unfortunately, a long winter and possibly up to the election series of doctor strikes.
Yes, a consultant in the Metro suggesting that pay over the last 14 years has been eroded by over a third. So, as you said, a big gulf to try and meet. Anyway, lots more still to come. We'll have more of the stories making the papers, including one by Pippa, in fact. The headline, Sunak tells the COVID inquiry that he cannot access WhatsApps from his time as Chancellor. That and plenty more, just a moment. Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview with me once again, the political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Crerar, and the political editor of the Daily Mail, Jason Groves, both joining us from Manchester and the Conservative Party conference. Welcome to you. And talking of the Prime Minister, your story in The Guardian, Sunak unable to access his WhatsApp messages from his time as Chancellor. This is for the COVID inquiry, Pippa.
Yeah, here we go again. I mean, the High Court ruled in July that the government had to hand over potentially embarrassing WhatsApp and Signal and text messages to the inquiry, because the Cabinet Office had initially refused to do so, saying that some of that material that they'd sought was unambiguously irrelevant. And you'll remember, Anna, back to Boris Johnson claiming that he was unable to access his mobile phone, which he had to change after a security breach, after his phone number was published on the internet in April 2021, and suggesting that he was too afraid to turn it on because it might be wiped, and that the security officials in the Cabinet Office would have to do it for him. And the last we heard of this was back in July, when we were told that they'd managed to access the messages and that they'd been handed over to the inquiry. Well, what I have been told, I've seen excerpts from the witness statements that both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak have submitted to the inquiry. And what they show is, in Boris Johnson's case, that even though he was using that phone until April 2021, he's been unable to access his messages from that key period from January to, I think it was January to July in 2020, the first lockdown during the pandemic. Those messages have mysteriously disappeared. Obviously, we thought that this could end up being the case back at the time, but the expectation was very much that Rishi Sunak would be handing his messages over from when he was Chancellor. But lo and behold, he's not been able to access his either, because he's changed phones several times and he didn't back them up. So unfortunately for all of us, we're not going to be able to see some of those communications that went on at that time. Both of them have suggested that others who perhaps the recipients of some of those messages, or indeed officials in the Treasury in Rishi Sunak, who obviously was then Chancellor's case, might have copies of those messages. But it's less than optimal, really, for the inquiry. And actually, I think the tensions that already exist between some of the politicians and Baroness Hallett, the chair of the inquiry, about transparency and accessing some of that information are only set to heighten with the with the fact that they've refused to, or been unable, I should say, sorry, to hand over those specific messages.
Yes.
We have got Matt Hancock's.
We've got a lot of Matt Hancock's to pour over.
Yes, we've all read those, haven't we? Let's go to the Daily Mail now. Jason, your paper, not you, your deputy, I think, probably. Britain is the best country to be black in. This is Kemi Badenoch, speaking to the Conservative Party conference, I guess, but also one of those, presumably, who'd be a runner and rider to replace Sunak if the Conservatives lose the next election.
That's right, and Kemi Badenoch's got quite a wide brief, and she ranged right the way across it today, and maybe even a little bit beyond, talking about business, talking about Brexit, talking about trade, but also talking about this equalities brief, which is where this sort of quite startling quote came from. She was making the point, really, which she's been making for a little while, that she doesn't feel that Britain is the kind of racist country it's sometimes portrayed as, and explain that she tells her daughters when she puts them to bed at night that actually Britain's the best place in the world to be black, because people don't look at your colour, they look at you. And it feels to me like that will be quite a big talking point tomorrow.
Jason Groves, Pippa Crerar, lovely to see you both. Thank you.